Not yet. Okay. Name first. I missed you at the start.
My name is
Julius? Okay.
I had a hard time trying to find you, but I just want to know from the beginning of your seminar if there are key points.
Yeah. So Julius, I think in the interest of time for all the folks who work here, sorry you had a hard time finding us, but this session is being recorded. So we will get that recording to you, and it is also like the deck will also be provided to you. But really where we started was the importance of why we're telling stories, the 4 parts of telling stories. I think that around which time you and your friend walked in, content, structure, design, and delivery being the 4 pillars of building a good story. And we're right now working our way through what a structure for a good story can look like. Is that helpful? Okay, Amanda.
So in terms of calls to action,
Yeah.
So usually when you're started, it'll sound crazy. So
First time I've heard that. Keep going.
Yes. Really?
I've heard it.
Okay. Like pretty much if your vision isn't so far-fetched for
Yeah.
people's comfort zone, then you're not gonna get enough people who are buying into what it is. So for example, when Kanye was hanging out with and all that stuff, everybody was kind of like, it's terrible, we're bad. But as time is still sure enough. So my thing is how far-fetched or where's the line that you want people to buy into what this is?
Yeah.
Draw the line.
Yeah. So good question. So Amanda's asking the question about how out there should your call to action be in order to get the audience to mobilize and actually take part in that call to action that you're putting out for them. Honestly, like my take is that you're not trying to sound crazy just for the sake of being crazy. Your idea might be crazy, which is perfectly fine, in which case your call to action might similarly be crazy. But you don't want it to be crazy just for the spectacle of it, right? What do I mean by that? Like when you start by thinking about your audience, what they care about, why they would care about your idea, and that's the place you're crafting the story from, you can connect with them on levels that are beyond just surprise and shock. You can connect with them because you empathize with them and you find them and relate to them in the situation that they find themselves in. And it has nothing to do with, you have this really crazy non-science backed claim that, you can restore all the hair that they lost, right? Like not many people are probably going to go for that. So your call to actions can be simple. It's like, if you believe in what I'm saying, support me by signing up for my newsletter or sign up to the website. Like the first launch of my products are going to go out in a week, like sign up for that so that and you can be the first to buy or pre-order or pre-trial the thing, right? So it can be small things that they can do to participate in your vision of the future without it having to be crazy or requiring a leap of faith in some sense. And I would go as far as to say, make the call to action actually actionable, in that it's easy for someone to participate and show that they actually believe in the future that you're painting for them, instead of trying to make it so hard for them to participate by making the call to action hard or difficult to relate to. At the end of the day, you want your audience to care about what you're saying. And if your call to action is easy and they don't, that's also telling you something that maybe you didn't get the part about who your audience is and what they care about right. And that's why what you're saying is not resonating with them. So you use every chance that you get to tell your story to actually test whether or not it's resonating with the audience that you care about and that you want them to care about your idea. So make it practical. Absolutely.
So the way that I'm thinking about this now is that,
by the way, I use this for my dissertation. You should too.
wow. It's like world building.
Mhm.
So like, you'll be
Absolutely.
having these ideas of like, this is what the world you live in now,
Mhm.
and the world that you could live in. Probably. I think that's the way to like create, because I know people always speak about like vision statements.
Yeah.
And like, this is just like a more built out, vision statement. Absolutely. Having the world that you've created in mind, you're trying to have your customer vision and say to you.
Absolutely. I
So I
think.
was gonna say, I don't have a question.
No,
It's just-
I'm glad that you said that out loud because I think it's relevant to all of us here. Your point about what you're doing really when you're telling the story is world building is 100% on the spot, right? Any of us, the reason why we love some movies and we can get lost in them is because they transport us to a different world that's different from ours. There's some things that are common. So how many of you are watching The Last of Us? Okay. Few of you, all right, but pick another show, Game of Thrones. Okay, come on, what are you guys watching these days?
I don't watch.
You don't watch
I
TV.
should go outside.
Our flag is
All right, so pick your favorite show or TV or movie ever. Maybe not something that you're watching right now. The reason that you like it is because it tells a story and you're able to relate to that story in some way, shape, or form. And that is world building. The greatest masters who've written great books, Stephen King, or the Childs, all of them are able to capture their audience because they transport you into their world. And there's some parts of that world that are familiar, like even in something that's as outlandish as Game of Thrones, you understand the father, daughter, son, mother, family unit, right? That all of us understand and we can relate to no matter which world it's placed in. People can be green in that world and we still understand what that family unit is trying to communicate to us. So in that version of the story, what is that? Is that family unit? Is that society structure that maybe is the thing that helps us relate to and then take us to what could be? So thank you for bringing that point. I appreciate that. We'll go to you, Patrick, and then remind me of your name.
My name is Jude.
Chidi? All right.
So I have a question about storytelling. I think one of my issues are, so when you're working on time pitches, so how do you know when to spend so much time on the beginning? When do you know, let's say you are storytelling and your audience, they seem real sleepy, they don't seem like they're not getting it. Do you kind of expand on the beginning to try to get them more engaged and then shorten the middle and the end, or my question?
I understand what your question. So you're saying, how do you, one, build a story structure if you have limited time?
Right.
And then how do you change what parts of the story you emphasize based on how your audience is reacting to you? And there are different ways in which you think about that. One is, I would say, like, just like you're changing the way you tell the story and the story structure based on the audience, you also have a different story and story structure based on how much time you have access to. That doesn't mean that your basic ideas change, but how much evidence you give in support of what is, what could be, where you spend the time on which parts of the story and how deep you go into maybe some research or supporting evidence changes based on how much time you have access to. So I think you heard me say at the start of this, this is a talk that I've given before, but this is a much more expanded talk because we have an hour and a half together. And so I'm able to dive into more details, whereas in previous, I would just rush past it. The other thing that I have the luxury to do here because I have more time is I can actually engage with you. Like, I can ask you questions, you can ask me questions back. And so anytime that you feel like your audience is not reacting to you, it's possible that you've gotten some of the basics, you're off on some of the basics, right? Like, you don't understand the audience that well, or you haven't figured out how to connect with the audience on what the idea is that they care about. So there are some pieces in which there's a disconnect, and how do we When they ask questions.
Oh, sorry.
All right, and how they're able to or not able to connect with the audience, right? So that's one of the ways in which you can figure out like where you're disconnected. And if I find myself in a place where the audience is sleepy, they're not reacting to me, I usually stop and just ask questions. You might not have the luxury to do that all the time. Like I've been in plenty of pitch competitions where you were given 3 minutes. You get to stand up here and give the 3-minute pitch and you walk off and there's no way you can engage with the audience. But you can also ask rhetorical questions, right? Like how many of us know that the public transportation system in Atlanta is messed up? And that doesn't require an actual answer from the audience. You can also do it by a show of hands. So there are ways in which you can engage with the audience without necessarily needing them to give you a response if you're short on time. But almost every time where you feel like you and the audience are disconnected, it's just basically best to stop and ask them a question so that the folks who will engage with you. Does that help? Okay. All right. We're going to take one question from here and then we'll go. Patrick, is it okay if I go to Shidi? All right.
Sure. Okay. Thank you for being here. My question is pertaining to entrepreneurs, specifically the ones on the story. How would you recommend fighting things like imposter syndrome or maybe stage fright as you are working to share your vision with people that might not be receptive?
Okay. So great question. You're asking about the entrepreneur, the person who's the messenger in some sense, right? About the actual delivery, the stage fright and all of that, there's actually a portion where we'll talk about the delivery of the message itself later, maybe in about 15 minutes. So we'll hit that then. But as for imposter syndrome and things like that, I really think that the best way to fight that is to find a mentor and build your own confidence. Like it's hard to build your confidence in isolation. Finding a group of people who are able to be your support system and give you honest feedback so that you can shore up the places where you feel like you're not being yourself and therefore feeling imposter syndrome. Finding a mentor who can do that. All of those are good ways for you. Or even if you are in a place where you have to do it yourself, can you write down the reasons you're feeling like you are being an imposter, right? And sometimes just putting that on paper helps us see, well, that's not really true. I might not be a world-class designer like Virgil Abloh, but I've studied Virgil Abloh. I've studied at a place like GSU. I have spent, I don't know how many hours like poring over Vogue in other magazines and like looking at the latest fashion shows. And I have a perspective on fashion that is different. And therefore, I think what I want to say should be heard. So how do you name the things that are causing you that stress, that imposter syndrome, and find ways for you to cope with and find evidence for why that might not be true and why your story and your point of view is actually worth being heard. Helpful?
Yes.
Okay. Question from our audience? Okay.
So we have 4.
Okay, we'll do 2.
Okay. So do I need to present a call to action when pitching to an investor? So that's like a quick.
Yeah, that's a good one. When you're talking to an investor, this is going to be counterintuitive advice. If you need to raise money and you're talking to an investor, ask for advice. Ask for advice about what are the holes in your business. Ask for advice about why someone would or wouldn't invest in it. And you should say, hey, I'm looking to raise this money, but I don't want you to give me the money. I want you to tell me what's wrong with my idea. And usually that's a great way to engage in a dialogue with the investor. And in doing that, they're going to be probably in a place where they have to make the decision of like, oh, if I were in a place where I'm making this decision, would I say yes or no? And so I've seen more scenarios where people who actually want to raise money have asked for advice and been successful. And if you want advice, ask for money because people will give you that for free. It's really helpful to have that mindset. But yes, the call to action can be I need money, or I need advice, or please help me connect to, these type of experts in the industry. So it doesn't have to be the obvious, give me money when you're talking to an investor. There can be a few different ways in which you can leverage investor connections.
The second question that and then we're gonna ask everyone's later. How do you summarize your financial need for your patient effectively and quickly? Assuming this is helpful in future projections.
Yeah. So if you are going to be asking for money, especially for a business pitch, yes, you do have to show financial projections. One of the key ways would be for you to at least say, here's how much money we've raised so far, what we've done with that money, and what are our next milestones. I really like presentations or pitches that talk about the milestones that the business needs to reach, what time frame those milestones will be reached in, and how much money do you need to get there. So you're actually not just saying, I need $5 million, but you're telling them, hey, I need $5 million because I want to increase the team size by 10 in the next year. I also want to do more marketing and outreach, and this is where I'm going to spend that money. And in return, I'm going to be seeing more customers. The product is going to improve this way, and I will hire software developers, right? So putting it in the context of milestones makes it very concrete and helps you anchor what you need the money for and how fast will you get to that point. Okay. Patrick, you want to ask me your question?
Oh, yeah. So my question, so my question is similar to my friend. She was asking about telling the story, like you focus on like every detail of the picture or on like the micro aspect. Like for example, Steve Jobs, he focused on the iPhone. Nobody anticipated that iPad actually.
If you have a product portfolio like the iPhone, the iPad, and the Mac, good God, man, like you're already going to succeed. Like, well, you don't even need any of this stuff. But point taken, like you're asking, how do you sequence things when there are a few different things that you want to talk about, or how much detail do you go? And it's honestly dependent on the context. So for something like this, where I know that there will be Q&A, I might not share everything with you, and we have some of those dialogues in and go over some points in the Q&A. And if you're ever pitching to an audience where you don't have the ability to do a Q&A, come up with a call to action that's even as simple as like, hey, my name is Patrick, here's my email. I'm going to be in this blue shirt in that corner after the pitch event is over, come find me, right? Like, how do you give them ways in which they can come in and ask you more questions? And then this is also a trick, but no matter what question somebody's asking you or might ask you, have some points that you want to cover during the Q&A, whether that question is asked or not. So you can say something like, hey, John, I know you asked me about like financial forecasts and stuff, but like really you have to also think about, the founder story and where do you tell that founder story in the pitch, right? So I want to make sure I mentioned that, but I didn't want to say it in the talk. So I'm saving some of those points for the Q&A and find a way to weave it into the answers that I give back to the audience. Helpful? All right, John?
Investors care more about emotion, because when you're telling the story, it's an emotional experience, right? And we have an emotional concept.
Yeah.
You're invested in the emotion. It's that, right? But at what point do they care about all of that?
Yeah.
Do you have to put that in the story too? Or?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll say people won't ask about the profits for something that they don't care about. So your first job is to get them to care enough to ask that question about whether or not it's going to make them money. So in sequencing it, definitely way more on the emotional connection that any part of your audience, investors or otherwise, can have to your story. So that then the follow-up question can be, okay, let me actually dig in more and find out about the business, the viability, the feasibility of what you're trying to do.
In other words, you're not pitching, hey, this is going to make money, you're pitching, this is good.
It could make money, and you should say that if it does, but that doesn't have to be the only thing that you're trying to tell them. Julius.
I have a question. They're like keys on coffee sheets, you like steer away from them. It's like stuff like that, like things that like you can see how.
Yeah, it's a good question, and my answer is going to sound like a dodge, but it's a mix of two things. One is knowing your audience, and two is how authentic can you be. So you can be authentic and talk about religion if you feel like you can respond to the questions that you might be asked. You're well versed enough and you're well read enough about the subject that you can engage in that dialogue. But if you're just using religion, politics, or any other hot button topic to make a point, I think that that's where you might want to step back and think about, is there a better way to tell this story? So if it's authentic to you, if you feel like you can genuinely engage in that dialogue, absolutely, you should make that part of your story. Don't make it, again, back to Amanda's thing, like don't use sensation just for the sake of sensation. All right, we're gonna move forward. So we've done two of them so far, and we have 20 minutes. I'm gonna zip through this last two portions. So we'll talk about design next, and design is more about the visual part of the story, right? Like, so in this particular engagement, it's the actual story slide deck that I'm using here to tell the story. And again, here, I will borrow heavily from the Duarte workshop. They have this concept called slideology. And what that actually means is people use slides and PowerPoint in ways that it was never meant to be used. They tell stories through text and not through associations, and the way objects and images can help tell you stories to support your ideas. And the whole idea is, you know, you can use a slide as a teleprompter, right? And all of you know what a teleprompter is. It's basically your speech written on it and then you read off of it. That's not what a slide deck is for. It's there to be your sidekick. It's there to help tell the story either in a different way or support what you're saying so that the audience gets there faster. So think of your slide deck as your support system, not the thing that is going to tell the story. Now, all of you in the audience who are thinking about, well, pitch decks that have to go over email, that have to tell the story when I'm not there, right? When you can't be the voice of the idea, that is very different from a slide deck that you present to and that you talk to. So in your head, the story stays the same, but the way you construct the slide deck when you're presenting and you are going to be the voice over versus the slide deck that goes and becomes a standalone thing that has to tell the story by itself. Both of those are very different artifacts and you have to think about them differently too. So that's step number one. So think about that first. And again, the story stays the same. You're starting with the audience, you're starting with the structure of the story, but how much text is there? How do you put your visuals? Can you use animations and stuff like that? All of that changes based on whether it's going to be sent by email and consumed by somebody, or you can stand there and give the voiceover for the story, okay? So a lot of the principles that we'll talk about today are more for the slide deck that you will narrate over and not the one that you want to send and have it be a standalone thing. If you do want to learn about creating those types of documents that are standalone, write this phrase down. It's called slide docs, SLIDE-DOCS. And Duarte actually has like a whole section that they go over that you can just look up slide docs and Duarte. And they have this whole like presentation that you can download that shows you how to create those standalone documents based on the story that you want to tell. All right, so there are 5 parts of a slideology, or like the visual part of telling your story. And those 5 parts are content, part of what we already covered, so we're not going to go into too much detail on that. Once you have that content, how do you clarify around the big idea that you're trying to tell? How do you use contrast? How do you use data and visuals to compel the audience to grasp the idea that you're trying to share? And how do you be consistent in your visuals in creating the deck itself? So we'll go quickly over some of these pieces. The content piece we've talked about already. We talked about how we gather all of the existing content that you have. How do we build on that by building on the new content that you need? And then how do we put all of those ideas up in a digital or physical space so you can look at all the pieces and start to order the ideas. So once you order the ideas, you then create the structure that we discussed, right? Like the tension between the what is, what could be, how do you build that arc, that narrative arc that has the beginning, a middle, and an end. Creating call to actions, creating that tension in the narration and your drama for your story. And so after that, you have now, what you should have at this point is basically a rough idea of like your story arc. What are the different pieces of evidence that you're going to show at the different parts of that story arc to tell your story? So you have Post-it notes and a squiggly line that tells you your story arc. That's where we are. And now we're going to actually start building a slide deck that supports that story arc. So the first idea that we want to work with is clarify. I'm an engineer, so I'm going to use an engineering concept here. All of you are familiar with signal and noise, right? So there's signal and there's noise. Signal part is great. You don't want the noise to come through. And so in all of, it's a weird color. In all of your slides, every slide that you're putting up, you have to ask yourself, what part of what I'm putting up here is signal and what part of what I'm putting up here is noise. And so we'll do a small exercise here to figure out, you know, how much of what you are putting up is signal and how much of what you're putting up is noise. This one's super easy, signal or noise. Too much going on, not helpful at all. There's a lot of noise here, right? Okay, slightly harder, signal or noise? How many of you say noise? Okay, how many of you say signal? Okay, all right, so let's hear from the signal. Why do you think it's signal?
Okay.
Okay.
Looking at the composition.
Uh-huh.
I don't know where to say exactly, but I know. I can't see this part, so I'm gonna trust it's important because the rate is right.
All right, okay. Folks in the noise camp, why do we think it's noise? Go ahead. Perfect. You're 100% right. The picture has nothing to do with the quote. So while the structure, the composition, and everything else about the slide itself, you can't find fault with. What is the main message that the slide is trying to communicate? This main message is that everything should be made simple, but not simpler. And is that maybe if it was a picture of Albert Einstein, maybe, right? So what does Marilyn Monroe or her picture have anything to do with the message that we're trying to communicate using the slide? So understanding that just because a slide is pretty doesn't make it signal was what I was trying to communicate here. Like it needs to support the idea that you and the message that you're trying to share on the slide. So signal is important in that context as well. You can't make it pretty and leave it there. It has to have a functional purpose. Okay, I'm gonna try and move this. Okay, how about this one? Signal, right? Like that is a quote that you can attribute to Dr. King, and we all know that that picture is iconic. So here is some place where the message that you're trying to communicate on the slide is actually supported by the visuals you're using on the slide as well. So that's what I meant by clarify the message. And in order to clarify the message on the slide, you have to know what is the message you're trying to communicate with that slide. So clarity comes in your visuals only when you have clarity in your mind about what that slide and the message is that has to be communicated. Okay. So the next one that we're going to talk about is, in order to get to that clarity, you should have a message, only one idea that you're trying to communicate in every slide that you show. Not 10 ideas in one slide. You can have an overarching slide that tells, okay, here are the 10 ideas I will talk about, but it needs to be structured like that. And what do I mean? So here's an example. Very generic text, right? It is, I would call this a teleprompter, right? Like this is something that you would read off of This is not something that you would speak to. It's not a slide that is clear in the message that is trying to communicate. What is it trying to communicate? It's trying to say something sets our company apart, but the idea is not clear. There's way too much going on. And in fact, there are actually 3 different messages that are on the slide. And what we actually want the audience to go away with is like, what is the thing that sets our company apart? There might be 3 ideas behind it, but you don't want to see the details that support all of that ideas just yet. So something like this is better, right? We're already in the direction of, okay, there are 3 things that set our company apart. Here are those 3 things. That could be one message in a slide. But all of these different ideas to go into the details, they have to be slides of their own, where you're drilling into those details one by one. And we want to use relationships to clarify. And what do I mean by relationships? There are different ways in which information is related to each other. Sometimes there are network relationships, sometimes it's an order, 1 comes, 2 comes, 3 comes. So how do you use relationships to tell your story and support your ideas? So what do we mean? If we go back to this slide, this is maybe we're heading in the right direction, but we can use that information in a different way, right? Like now the message and the idea becomes much clearer. You're now saying there are 3 things that are competitive advantages, and that's all I want you to know at this point. I will go into more details about each of these pieces of competitive advantages as we move forward, but at this point, the only thing that you need to know is that these 3 reasons are why our company is different. Okay? All right. And so if we were to just drill in on the global reach part, you can then talk about, the colors are not rendering correctly, so I apologize for that, but you can now go into details in a different way. All of these are using the same message on that slide that we showed before that had all of that text. And how do you simplify, how do you clarify to just show the key message that you want to communicate to your audience? And instead of drowning them, you kind of have to take control of the story and say, at this point, all I want you to know is this. Once we're clear on that, let's now talk about the details of point number 1, and then talk about the details of point number 2. And using animations, using all of these different visual tools that PowerPoint gives you to be able to do that well. That's what we're trying to get our audience to. And so it's like, so very gross metaphor, but it's almost like a mother bird pre-chewing the food for its babies. Like you have to be able to tell the audience what they need to know, when they need to know it, not anytime before that, not anytime after that. So creating your slides and your narrative helps you do that in that controlled format. All right, the next one is contrast. Again, a design principle, but very simply it's to enhance understanding, right? Like we human beings are very good at playing this game called pick the odd one out. We're drawn to seeing the thing that is different from the others, and contrast plays on that. And there are a few different ways in which you can create contrast: size, shape, color, and proximity are 4 ways in which you can create contrast. So if we were to go back to our slide examples that we were using, if you want to show superior technology, maybe the way we show it is like this, like the fact that we're using color and size to show what is, to create contrast in that message and clarify what we're trying to communicate with that message. The next idea to also help with this is white space. As you can see, most of the slides in this deck are very sparse. There's not that much on there because I don't want you to read. I want you to listen to what I have to say. And they're really there to provide like a background score, to play my sidekick, my support character. And white space, embracing that, not being afraid of, trying to fill everything on the slide. That's really important. And then hierarchy. I really hate it when people put a lot of text and think that all of them are equal. There's always going to be something that's a title or the leading idea, and then things that support it. So how do you think about hierarchy in your ideas? This is a very weird example, but if you ever made a slide deck about what you want to tell your spouse, that is important. You don't want to bury the fact that you're moving to Atlanta on like point number 3, like subdivided down, right? Like important ideas need to, that might be the title of the slide, like we are moving to Alaska next month, and then everything else comes second to that. So don't bury the lead. Like audiences are very, very prone to reading things top down, and we go from left to right. So knowing where you put your important ideas that you want them to get to first is important, because that way you know where to place your important ideas so that they don't miss them. So hierarchy is important for that. And then the last piece is so compelling. Compelling is very important, especially when you're using data or facts to support your story, especially for data slides. People think that bar graphs, pie charts, line plots, all of them are same, but they're not. We process information from all of those graphs differently. So pick the right tool for the job, and I'll show you a couple of examples. Get to the point. Again, human beings are not made to understand pie charts and all of that without a lot of help. So help them understand by using color, by drawing circles, by drawing their attention to the thing that you want them to pay attention to. Keeping it simple, so you don't have to use the same plot that Excel generates for you. Maybe you should take off the grid lines in the back and simplify the colors so that they fit with your color scheme. Make it simple and keep it consistent for the audience. And of course, highlighting what's important, right? Like you call their attention to what you want them to pay attention to, and telling the truth. It's very easy to obfuscate and use outliers or remove outliers and tell a story that the data doesn't support, but you want to tell the story that's in line with your data. So all of these are different examples of slides, of data slides that you could use. But if you were to look at an example, again, going back to what does your audience care about and what is the fact that supports your story, you should use the 76% of people prefer dogs. If you're telling a story about why dog food is going to be the most prevalent thing in the market next. But if you want to talk about pet preferences in general and why you want to open a pet store, you don't want to talk about 76% of people preferring dogs. You actually want to show the way you're going to stock your pet store based on the research that you've done about pet preferences, right? So picking the right tool for the job and showing the data that helps you tell your story is the whole point of using this compelling section. How do you compel your audience and support the narrative that you're trying to share? And you've seen me do this throughout today, but animations, like I said before, controlling the narrative of your story and your slides is your job. Making it simple for the audience is the whole goal here. So use animations to create builds instead of showing flat diagrams like this. Maybe you start by showing, hey, we have, as a company, we have global reach, and we have, why is that? We have 5 continental partnerships. We have business and regulatory relationships. There are key markets that we have access to, and we have a talent pool that's unrivaled. Like, I'm keeping control of the narrative and letting you see what I want you to see when I want you to see it, as opposed to seeing all of those points at the same time. And then you're not actually listening to me, you're reading the stuff on the slides. So animations help you keep control of your narrative. And then transitions. I haven't used a lot of those in the deck today, but this is something that many people don't know that PowerPoint does. But you can create timelines and continuations where slides slide and they go upward, sideways. And so you don't have to restrict yourself to the real estate that you have on the slide, but you can build continuations and tell stories in really interesting ways if you want to, even while you're using PowerPoint. And the last piece is being consistent. So this deck was completely built on this grid. And so consistency is key because, again, you're trying to make things simple for the audience. and helping them know where to look for the key important information and making sure it's always there all the time reduces the mental burden on your audience, and that's your job. So using a grid, making sure that you have the same footer, header elements. If you need to use them, I didn't use any today, but if you wanted to use them, that's all. Like what parts of it of the slide are signal, what parts of it are noise, how can you help keep the signal up? That's what all of these guidelines are supposed to help you get to. Before we move forward, I know we're at time. Any questions? Yes.
When you were talking about contrast, you said contrast.
Oh, we want you to.
Use this. So that the ball line here. Okay.
I just missed something.
Sorry.
Sorry, people online, it's probably not that exciting, but when you were talking about contrast, you said size, shape, something, and color. I just missed
I believe I said size, proximity was the last one. Size, shape, color, and proximity.
Okay, thank you so much.
That's correct. Thank you. Was there anything else? Comments, thoughts?
Great job.
Well, last one, we'll go through this really fast. Oh, color scheme and font, never mind. Keep the fonts and sizes also consistent. The delivery piece, I know Shidi, you asked about this, and there were a couple of questions online at the start too. I'm not gonna talk a lot about delivery, I'll just point you to some resources. But I think we had a couple of questions between Julius and Amanda and John, even you, about being authentic, right? Like how are you have to tell the story that makes the most sense to you. Just because something is sensational, just because that will get people participating in the dialogue doesn't mean that they'll actually take up on your call to action and do more. So being authentic and knowing how and when to relate to your audience is really important. And then body language. I pointed you to a book at the start of this called What Everybody is Saying. But there's also this TED Talk from this professor called Amy Cuddy on power posing. And Chidi, this is back to your question about imposter syndrome. So the whole study that she did was on imposter syndrome and how you can use body language and how you, this term that she coined called power posing, to cheat your body into thinking that you're not feeling stage fright, that you're not feeling like you're an imposter. So I highly recommend that you look it up if that's anything that's in your wheelhouse. I still like to use some of those power poses. The whole idea being that because we're all social animals, we take our cues from each other. And so if I get up and make myself really big and like I put my hands on my hips, that sends a different message from if I were to shrink down and like fold my hands and like bend over and deliver the same talk. So, and the key thing is it's not just doing it to the people around you. The way you stand and the way you deliver, the way you conduct yourself is also telling something about how you feel to your own body. The fact that you're comfortable enough to be able to take up more space and create room for yourself and project your voice says something to your body about like, I'm confident in this room. I know what I'm going to talk about. I know that these people will care about what I have to talk about. And that also tricks your body into behaving a different way than if you were to come in and say, okay, I'm scared, like I'm not really sure what I'm going to say. So there's a few ideas in there that are really powerful. So do check that out. And then vocals. Not the best person about this in the world. I have a lot of tics, as you guys might have picked up on, but human beings are very forgiving. We don't really register the ums and the ahs that people give. But if you want to get better at it and you want to project and use your full vocal range, I highly recommend that you check out this TED Talk by Julian Treasure. He actually talks about, it's a very short 10-minute talk, and he talks about all of these different ideas of how you can use silence, pauses, how you can become very quiet and what that does to the talk, and how you can get very loud and what that does to your talk, and how do you use that in your story structure, right? Remember that little tension graph that we drew between the what is and what could be that gave structure to your story. You can also make little notes that say, this is where I give a pause. This is where I get loud. This is where I tone it down and like make myself small. This is where I make myself big and make my gestures big. So your vocals, your body language can be another track that's sort of overlaid on your story that you're building and your deck that you're building and how you deliver that to your audience. Okay. With that, I think I'm at the end of this. Thank you all very, very much for being here today and for asking great questions. For our online crew, I'm sorry we didn't get to ask many of your questions, but I'll be around for the next 10, 15 minutes if folks want to talk to me one-on-one. Thank you all.